On the morning of May 29th, 1453, a 21-year-old man sat on a white horse outside the most famous walls in the world. For over 1,000 years, those walls had protected Constantinople, the legendary capital of the Byzantine Empire. Every conqueror who had ever tried to breach them had failed. The Persians had failed. The Arabs had failed. Even the young man's own ancestors had failed. But as the sun rose that morning, the young commander watched as his soldiers finally poured through a breach in those supposedly impregnable walls. And in that moment, he accomplished what no one had achieved in 11 centuries. He brought down an empire. His name was Mehmed II, and while the world would eventually call him Mehmed the Conqueror, what's truly remarkable about his story isn't just that he conquered Constantinople. It's that just 9 years earlier, this same young man had been a 12-year-old boy, thrust onto a throne he wasn't ready for, facing enemies who wanted to destroy him, and advisors who wanted to control him. He had been humiliated, deposed, and sent away in disgrace. And yet somehow, that same boy grew up to become one of the most successful military commanders in all of history. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of these historical deep dives, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here. So if that's of interest to you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 30th, 1432, in the Ottoman capital of Edirne, a baby was born to Sultan Murad II and one of his harem concubines named Huma Hatun. The baby was named Mehmed after the Prophet Muhammad, and from the moment he entered the world, his fate was tied to power, politics, and war. But Mehmed wasn't the heir. He was actually the fourth son of Murad II, which meant he was far from the throne. In the Ottoman system, princes didn't just sit around the palace waiting for their turn to rule. They were sent to distant provinces to learn how to govern. It was a training ground, but it was also a way to keep potential rivals far from the capital where they couldn't cause trouble. So when Mehmed was just 2 years old, he was sent away from his mother and sent to the city of Amasya in central Anatolia. There, his older half-brother Ahmed was serving as the provincial governor. Mehmed would grow up in Ahmed's shadow, learning the basics of administration and statecraft. But then, in 1437, when Mehmed was only 5 years old, something unexpected happened. His brother Ahmed died suddenly. And because the Ottomans didn't believe in leaving provinces ungoverned, 5-year-old Mehmed was appointed as the new governor of Amasya. Of course, he didn't actually rule anything. Advisors called lalas handled all the real work. But officially, on paper, a 5-year-old was now responsible for an entire province. It was during these years that Mehmed began his education in earnest. His father sent a stream of tutors to teach him everything a future ruler might need to know: theology, history, mathematics, and most importantly, military strategy. Among his teachers was a scholar named Molla Gurani, who instilled in Mehmed a deep knowledge of Islamic teachings. But perhaps even more influential was a spiritual advisor named Akshim Seddin, who planted an idea in Mehmed's young mind that would shape the rest of his life. Akshim Seddin told Mehmed about a prophecy. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad himself had said that one day a Muslim army would conquer Constantinople, the great Christian city that had resisted Islam for 8 centuries. The Prophet had reportedly declared that the commander who achieved this conquest would be truly blessed. Akshim Seddin believed that Mehmed could be that commander. The idea consumed the young prince. He read everything he could about Constantinople. He studied the previous sieges that had failed. He analyzed the city's famous walls, the Theodosian walls, which were considered the greatest fortifications in the medieval world. Even as a child, he was planning how he might one day breach them. But there was a problem. Mehmed was still just a prince, not a sultan. His father, Murad II, was very much alive and showed no signs of giving up power. And besides, Mehmed had older brothers who stood between him and the throne. That all changed in 1443. Mehmed's remaining older brother, Alauddin Ali, was assassinated under mysterious circumstances. Some historians believe Murad himself ordered the killing to eliminate a potential rival for Mehmed. Others think it was the result of court intrigue. Either way, the assassination left 11-year-old Mehmed as the sole surviving heir to the Ottoman throne. Murad immediately summoned his son back to the capital. Whatever childhood Mehmed had known was officially over. By 1444, Sultan Murad II was exhausted. He had spent over 2 decades fighting wars on multiple fronts. He had battled crusaders, been rebelled against by his own vassals, and lost his favorite son. The constant warfare had worn him down, and he desperately wanted peace. In June of 1444, Murad achieved what he thought was a diplomatic triumph. He signed a 10-year peace treaty with Hungary, the most powerful Christian kingdom in Eastern Europe. The treaty seemed to secure his borders and finally give him a chance to rest. And so Murad did something that shocked the entire world. He abdicated the throne. He handed power to his 12-year-old son Mehmed and retired to the city of Manisa, where he planned to spend his remaining years in quiet contemplation. Now on paper, this might have seemed like a smooth transition, but in reality, it was anything but. Mehmed was just a child, and everyone knew it. His advisors were divided into factions that hated each other. On one side was the Grand Vizier, Sandar Halil, an experienced statesman who believed the empire needed cautious, defensive policies. On the other side were the viziers, Zaganos and Shihabeddin, who saw young Mehmed as someone they could influence and push toward aggressive expansion. Both factions claimed to be protecting the rights of the child sultan, but both were really trying to control him. And then there were the Europeans. When word spread that a 12-year-old had taken the Ottoman throne, the Christian powers saw an opportunity they couldn't pass up. Pope Eugene IV immediately began organizing a new crusade. He convinced the Hungarian king Vladislav III to break the peace treaty that had just been signed. The Pope argued that promises made to infidels weren't binding, so Hungary was free to attack. In September of 1444, just weeks after Mehmed took the throne, a massive crusader army crossed the Danube River and began marching into Ottoman territory. For Mehmed, this was a nightmare. He was 12 years old, and he was facing the combined might of Hungary, Poland, and various Balkan states. The Crusaders believed they could crush the Ottomans while they were weak. They fully expected to destroy this child's empire. Back in Edirne, panic spread through the capital. Riots broke out. A religious sect was massacred in the streets. People began fleeing the city, fearing the Crusaders would soon arrive at the gates. Mehmed knew he was in over his head. He was brilliant for his age, but he was still just a boy. He had never commanded an army in battle, and the Crusader force bearing down on him was led by John Hunyadi, one of the most feared military commanders in all of Europe. So Mehmed made a decision that showed remarkable maturity for a child. He swallowed his pride and did what he had to do. He wrote a letter to his father. The letter has become legendary in Ottoman history. In it, Mehmed wrote words that have been quoted for centuries. "If you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I hereby order you to come and lead my armies." It was brilliant. Mehmed wasn't begging his father to come back. He was framing it as either a request or a command, depending on who was really in charge. Either way, Murad had to return. And Murad did return. He gathered an army and marched to meet the Crusaders at a place called Varna, on the coast of the Black Sea. On November 10, 1444, the two armies clashed in one of the most decisive battles of the 15th century. The fighting was brutal. At one point, the Crusaders seemed to be winning. King Vladislav, riding high on apparent victory, led a cavalry charge directly at the Ottoman center, hoping to kill Murad himself and end the battle in one stroke. It was a fatal mistake. Vladislav rode straight into a wall of janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry. His horse was killed beneath him, and he was surrounded. The janissaries cut him down and chopped off his head, mounting it on a pike. The sight of their king's head broke the Crusaders' morale. The battle turned into a rout. Thousands of Christian soldiers were killed, and the crusade collapsed completely. Back in Edirne, young Mehmed received news of the victory. His throne was secure, at least for now. His father returned briefly, and then, to Mehmed's relief, went back into retirement. But Mehmed's first reign was far from stable. His viziers continued fighting each other. The janissaries, who had saved the empire at Varna, now demanded higher pay and threatened to revolt if they didn't get it. Mehmed, just a teenager, was forced to give in to their demands, setting a dangerous precedent that would haunt the Ottoman Empire for centuries. Even worse, Mehmed's advisors, Zeganos and Shihabedin, began pushing him toward an ambitious project, the conquest of Constantinople. They believed that if Mehmed could take the legendary city, it would cement his legitimacy and make him a legend. But the Grand Vizier Tundali Halil thought this was madness. Constantinople had walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Attacking it would be expensive, risky, and probably futile. He worked behind the scenes to undermine Mehmed's authority. In 1446, things came to a head. Tundala Halil engineered a revolt among the janissaries. The soldiers demanded that Murad II return to the throne. Faced with open rebellion, Mehmed had no choice. At just 14 years old, he was forced to step down. Murad returned to power, and Mehmed was sent back to Manisa in disgrace. He was still technically a sultan, but everyone knew the truth. He had failed. He had been deemed too young, too inexperienced, and too weak to rule. For the next 5 years, Mehmed lived in a kind of exile. He continued his education, reading Greek and Latin classics alongside Islamic texts. He studied military history obsessively, particularly the accounts of Alexander the Great, whom he idolized. He learned multiple languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and possibly Hebrew. But he also nursed his grudges. He never forgot the men who had humiliated him, and he never stopped dreaming of Constantinople. On February 3, 1451, Sultan Murad II died, and this time there was no question about who would take the throne. Mehmed was 19 years old, the only surviving son, and he was ready. He rode to Edirne immediately and took control of the empire. One of his first acts was to order the execution of his infant half-brother, a baby who could have grown up to challenge his rule. It was brutal, but it was also standard Ottoman practice. Mehmed would later formalize this custom into law, declaring that future sultans should eliminate their brothers to prevent civil war. The young sultan then turned his attention to anyone who had opposed him during his first reign. He was particularly cold toward Andali Halil, the Grand Vizier who had engineered his removal from power. For now, Mehmed kept Halil in his position, but he made it clear that the old man was on borrowed time. Meanwhile, European observers watched the succession with relief. They assumed that this young sultan would be weak, inexperienced, and easily manipulated. Surely he would need years to consolidate power before he could pose any threat. They were catastrophically wrong. Within months of taking the throne, Mehmed began preparing for the conquest of Constantinople. He moved with a speed and focus that caught everyone off guard. First, he neutralized potential enemies through diplomacy. He signed peace treaties with Hungary and Venice, buying himself time. Then he began building up his military forces, expanding the Janissary Corps and commissioning a fleet of warships. But his most important preparation involved technology. Mehmed had long understood that Constantinople's walls were the key to its survival. No army had ever breached them, but Mehmed believed that the rules of siege warfare were about to change. In 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Orban arrived at Mehmed's court. Orban was a cannon maker, and he claimed he could build guns large enough to destroy any wall in the world. Interestingly, Orban had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Dyatlov, but Constantine couldn't afford to pay him, so Orban went to the Ottomans instead. Mehmed hired him immediately and gave him unlimited resources. Over the next several months, Orban built the largest cannon the world had ever seen. It was called the Basilica, and it could fire stone balls weighing over 1,300 pounds. The cannon was so massive that it took 60 oxen and 200 men to transport it. At the same time, Mehmed built a fortress called Rumeli Hisar on the European side of the Bosporus Strait, directly across from an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Together, these two fortresses gave the Ottomans complete control over all ship traffic entering the Black Sea. Constantinople was effectively cut off from resupply. When Byzantine ambassadors complained about the fortress, Mehmed threatened to have them skinned alive if they ever bothered him again. The young sultan, who had once been pushed around, was making it clear that those days were over. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed's army arrived outside Constantinople. Contemporary accounts estimate his force at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men, though some Ottoman sources claimed numbers as high as 200,000. Either way, it was the largest army ever assembled for a siege in medieval history. Against this horde, Byzantine Emperor Constantine Dyatlov had roughly 7,000 defenders. That's all. Just 7,000 men to defend 14 miles of walls. Mehmed set up his red and gold command tent directly opposite the weakest section of the walls, a stretch called the Mesotikion. He positioned his massive cannons and began a bombardment that would last for weeks. The Basilica cannon fired only about 7 times per day because it took so long to reload, but each shot was devastating. Stone balls smashed into walls that had stood for 1,000 years, creating cracks and eventually breaches. Still, the Byzantines held on. Every night, they repaired the damage done during the day, filling gaps with rubble and earth. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, proved to be a brilliant defender, organizing work crews and directing the repairs. But Mehmed had another problem. His navy couldn't get into the Golden Horn, the harbor that formed Constantinople's northern boundary. The Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the harbor entrance, blocking any ships from entering. Without control of the Golden Horn, Mehmed couldn't attack the city's weaker sea walls. So Mehmed did something that seemed impossible. On the night of April 22nd, he ordered his men to haul approximately 70 ships overland. They built a road of greased logs over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and then they literally dragged their ships from the Bosporus around the chain and into the Golden Horn. When the Byzantines woke up the next morning and saw Ottoman ships floating in their protected harbor, they were horrified. This feat of engineering had bypassed their most important defense in a single night. Now the defenders had to spread their already thin forces even thinner, guarding seawalls they had never expected to defend. The siege continued for another month. The Ottomans launched multiple assaults, all of which were repulsed. Mining operations were detected and countered. Mehmed even tried building siege towers, which the defenders burned. Inside the city, people were starving. Morale was collapsing. Strange omens appeared. A lunar eclipse, an unexplained fog, and a mysterious light seen above the dome of Hagia Sophia. Many believed these were signs that the city was doomed. On May 28th, Mehmed gathered his war council. Some advisors, including the Grand Vizier Tandali Halil, argued that the siege should be abandoned. They had been outside the walls for nearly 2 months, and the city still stood. Perhaps it really was unconquerable. But Mehmed refused. He announced that a final, all-out assault would begin the following day. That night, the entire Ottoman camp went silent. Soldiers prepared for battle, praying and resting. Inside Constantinople, the defenders held one last religious ceremony in Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic Christians, who had been bitterly divided for centuries, prayed together for salvation. Emperor Constantine XI toured the walls, thanking his men for their service. In the early hours of May 29th, the Ottoman assault began. Mehmed sent wave after wave against the walls. First came the irregular troops, the Bashi bazouks, whose job was essentially to tire out the defenders. Then came the Anatolian regular infantry, then the elite janissaries. The fighting was savage. The defenders held their ground for hours. But then, disaster struck. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had been the backbone of the defense, was wounded. He was carried from the walls to be treated, and when his men saw their leader fall, their morale crumbled. At almost the same moment, a group of Ottoman soldiers discovered a small gate called the Kirkoporta that had been left open by mistake. They poured through, and suddenly there were enemy troops inside the walls. The defense collapsed. Emperor Constantine XI reportedly threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting, determined to die with his city. His body was never identified. By noon, it was over. After 1,123 years as a Christian capital, Constantinople had fallen. Mehmed II rode through the shattered gates on a white horse and went directly to Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He walked inside, climbed to the altar, and ordered that the building be converted into a mosque. As he surveyed the conquered city, Mehmed reportedly quoted a Persian poem. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watches in the towers of Afrasiab. 1,000 years of history had ended, and a 21-year-old had ended it. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Many believed it was the beginning of the end times. The Pope called for new crusades that never materialized. Greek scholars fled westward, bringing with them classical texts that would help spark the Renaissance. For Mehmed, the conquest was just the beginning. He spent the next 28 years expanding his empire in all directions. He conquered Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and parts of Greece. He fought Venice in a 16-year war. He even landed troops in Italy, capturing the city of Otranto in 1480. The boy who had been deposed at 14 grew into a man who ruled the most powerful empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. He spoke 7 languages, patronized artists and scientists, collected ancient manuscripts, and transformed Constantinople, now called Istanbul, into one of the greatest cities in the world. But he never forgot his humiliations. After the conquest, Mehmed had the Grand Vizier Kandarli Halil arrested and executed. The man who had once engineered Mehmed's removal from power paid the ultimate price for that betrayal. Mehmed died on May 3, 1481, at the age of 49. He was preparing yet another military campaign, possibly aimed at conquering Rome itself. Some historians believe he was poisoned by rivals at court, though the truth remains uncertain. What is certain is his legacy. The Ottoman Empire that Mehmed built would survive for another 4.5 centuries, controlling lands from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. And it all traced back to a stubborn, brilliant boy who refused to accept that some things were impossible. The prophecy that his teacher had told him all those years ago had come true. He had become the blessed conqueror of Constantinople. He had achieved what no one else in 800 years had managed. And it had all started when a 12-year-old wrote a letter to his father, demanding that if he was truly the Sultan, he should act like one. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, We have a whole playlist of incredible historical stories ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. Alright, until next time, see you.